Sustainability Defined is brought to you by Elm Sustainability Partners, a leading provider of sustainability and ESG advisory services globally. Elm's latest campaign, Rethink, encourages companies to think about their existing sustainability, CSR, and ESG programs and how they stack up against today's higher expectations from investors, customers, and the public. Do you need to rethink? Find out more at www.elmsustainability.com/rethink. All right, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Scott and I are here defining sustainability one topic and one bad joke at a time. Scott, we're back.
Jay, we are back with new concepts. There's many more to cover.
My goodness, it's a seemingly endless number. And Scott, you know, like the tide, we went out and we came right back as promised. And I am so excited to get back going again.
Have you been thinking about that for like the past 3 months? Like, what is the pun you're going to give to start us off?
You would think so. And if I had been, I would have hoped it would have been a little bit better. So I mean, I'll let listeners determine the answer to that themselves.
I mean, to me, it was like what I said to you the other day. It's kind of like what Jack said to Kate on Lost. We have to go back.
Scott, I never watched Lost.
Oh, man. The ending's not worth the 7 seasons, so.
Oh,
don't bother.
We might say the same thing about Game of Thrones. Anyways, Scott, today our episode is on equity in cities. And so this is what it's going to look like. Number one, we're going to ask, why are we talking about city equity on a show that's focused on sustainability? Number two, we're going to go through an overview of equity in cities. Number three, we're going to give some historical context for these equity issues in cities. Number four, we're going to discuss equity in cities today. Number five, how cities are advancing sustainability and equity at the same time. And then finally, we're going to transition to my interview with Tinianow and Rob Phocas, the Chief Sustainability Officer for Denver, Colorado, and the Director of Sustainability for Charlotte, North Carolina, respectively.
Jay, you didn't once say we're going to branch into something. What is this?
I hate to say this, Scott, but I've become self-conscious of how often I say the word branch, whether it is in this podcast or when I'm referring to someone else's office location.
Nice.
All right, so Scott, why don't you kick us off? Tell us why we're talking about city equity on a show that's focused on sustainability.
Okay, Jay, so when we think green cities, our mind often goes directly to things like water efficiency, renewable energy use, recycling rates, number of parks. And those are important, but sustainability is not just about the impact on the environment. There's also social and economic pillars. Sustainability asks, can we operate our cities, our businesses, etc., in a sustainable way? In other words, in a way that minimizes harm to the environment, has enough revenue to operate, and supports healthy and livable communities.
And Scott, that social pillar that you mentioned is frequently referred to as social sustainability, and it's often
very original.
Wonder where we got that one.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's often cited as the least developed of those 3 sustainability pillars.
Well, I will say, Jay, that you and I have long given social love. If you look at our sustainability tree on our website with the many branches that Jay likes, we categorize our episodes. And from the beginning, one has been social. And on there are episodes like Green Schools, which is episode number 5, and Sustainability in Art, episode number 27. And so there's actually a lack of agreement on a definition for social sustainability.
But of course, Scott, here at Sustainability Defined and our rigorous analytical processes, we saw one and liked one that is, quote, social sustainability occurs when the formal and informal processes, systems, structures, and relationships actively support the capacity of current and future generations to create healthy and livable communities. Socially sustainable communities are equitable, diverse, connected, and democratic, and provide a good quality of life, end quote.
Sounds good to me. I will say, Jay, is it processes or processes?
Is it branches, Scott, or branchies?
Maybe our listeners can let us know. I don't know. But in short, social sustainability means that reducing water consumption, using more solar and wind energy, reducing carbon emissions, these are not sufficient. We must also consider the impact of these changes on the disadvantaged and if these positive changes are happening in all parts of the community.
Right. And Scott, in the definition we read, you heard the word equity. There is, of course, much more to social sustainability than equity, but equity is going to be what we focus on here today. So let's hope, Scott, that equates to another great episode.
Oh, geez.
Bad jokes are back, baby. Mm-hmm. All right, Scott, why don't you give us an overview of equity in cities?
So equity means that as we work to make our cities more sustainable, we also ensure that all groups have access to the resources and opportunities necessary to improve the quality of their lives. It also means that differences in life outcomes cannot be predicted on the basis of race, class, or other dimensions of identity.
Let's consider access to green space as an example. If our goal is to plant more trees in the urban forest as a way to reduce carbon emissions, conserve energy, and improve well-being, that plan cannot purely be about increasing the city's tree cover. That plan must also consider how to engage residents in all parts of the city and make sure that there is no bias towards improving tree cover for certain residents or neighborhoods over others.
So unfortunately, not all city sustainability plans do what you're talking about, Jay, and consider equity. In fact, one researcher looked at 28 medium and large U.S. cities and found that most of these cities ignore equity goals as part of their climate and sustainability plans, or at least treat them as secondary or tertiary goals relative to the environmental and economic goals that are at the forefront of the plan.
It's unfortunate, Scott, because really equity is important to consider in these sustainability plans, not only because it's more just, but also because the poorest among us live and work in areas most prone to things like flooding, heat waves, and other climate change effects.
It's a cruel truth of climate change.
It is. Yeah. And unfortunately, they are the least resourced to prepare adequately for and withstand those impacts. In fact, the 4th National Climate Assessment here in the U.S. found that these lower income communities already have higher rates of many adverse health conditions, are more exposed to environmental hazards, and take longer to bounce back from natural disasters. These existing inequalities will only be exacerbated due to climate change. It's a real issue, Scott.
It is. And I think, Jay, for us to get deeper into this, we need to give some historical context of how cities have developed. This is maybe the most quick historical context of just cities generally, but we're going to do it in about a minute here.
Oh,
so,
boy.
Jay, start us off.
So I'll start us off with an important caveat here, Scott, which is that, of course, this is an incredibly complex topic, and that no city is the same. Every city has its own story relative to its successes and failures that has brought it to where it currently is. However, Scott, what you're about to share with us should help us frame these issues moving forward.
Okay, so before the 2 world wars, cities were the center of industrial production. They were located along strategic trade routes. This made them crowded, dirty, and impoverished. But after the 2 world wars, a middle class emerged and people moved to the suburbs as white flight exacerbated social ills in cities like racial segregation. That's it. For our historical context. Oh boy. Okay, well, we're doing this for the listeners, Jay, because we don't want to make these things longer than they need to be. And our focus here is on equity and what's going on today. So today we're seeing something of an urban renaissance. Historically less affluent areas that existed during and since white flight are now seeing people with higher incomes move into their neighborhoods.
Right. So, Scott, I will say it's a short description here, but you get the 2 different sides, right? So we have cities that have historically been less affluent. All of a sudden, as jobs start to move back to cities, we start to see a little bit of a clash of different incomes, and it's having all these different and interesting and sometimes unfortunate consequences in our cities. In fact, over the last decade, Scott, our biggest cities have accounted for over 70% of the nation's job growth. And a lot of these jobs are part of the so-called knowledge economy. So think finance, biotech, and coding. These are well-paying jobs, and they thrive in dense urban areas and have helped draw people back into these cities, again, with these well-paid incomes.
Right. And these people that are moving back, they like their hipster coffee bars and their specialty pet shops for dogs. But this recent job growth and population growth in our cities and these additional stores to serve them has not meant prosperity for all who live in cities.
That's right. And so this is a big one. Gentrification is racially resegregating our cities, which is a little bit weird to think about. So recall that gentrification refers to the process of repairing and rebuilding homes and businesses in a deteriorating area, like an urban neighborhood, accompanied by an influx of middle-class or affluent people that often results in the displacement of earlier, usually poorer residents, many of whom are minorities.
And Jay, I was interested to learn about an offshoot of gentrification called green gentrification. Had you heard of this, Jay?
I actually never had, no.
No, me either. So an example of this is when more parks and farmers markets are introduced to a new, less affluent community. And that sounds like a great idea, but it can actually exacerbate the problem of gentrification by making the area even more attractive to potential gentrifiers and pricing out long-term residents. So green gentrification is when you have these actions that are taken to make an area, quote unquote, more green, more reduce the impact on the environment, and then it makes that area more attractive and prices people out.
It's almost counterintuitive, but honestly really unfortunate. And Scott, we can say that in addition to gentrification, the urban income gap is widening. So a recent Bloomberg analysis found that the chasm between America's top income earners and the middle class is widening in nearly every major metropolitan area.
And in the top 100 largest U.S. cities, Jay, the gap between the average salary of the top 5% and the middle 20% was $268,000 in 2012, and that ballooned to $333,000 in 2017. And that's just comparing the top to the middle. We're not even talking about how much lower the bottom segment is.
Okay, so Scott, these income disparities you cannot physically see. However, something you can see is homelessness, which in many cities is on the rise. So interestingly, analysis from Zillow shows that the overall level of homelessness has fallen nationwide, even as housing costs have increased. But when you look at specific cities, homelessness is still a pervasive problem, especially in cities with skyrocketing rent costs like DC, New York City, and San Francisco. And Scott, I'm sure the both of us living in two of those three cities can attest to that. It's something that you see very clearly on the streets.
Yeah, Jay, it is something that I see in DC quite a bit in a variety of neighborhoods, and I've lived here for 4 years now since graduating from grad school, and I haven't really seen like a noticeable difference in the problem. Really, either way, it just seems like a constant issue. And like you say, Jay, the rent costs are what drive a lot of this. In Los Angeles, where the rent burden, which is the share of income people spend on rent, is 49%, a 2 percentage point increase in that metric can result in an additional 4,000 people finding themselves on the street.
And Scott, interestingly, the analysis said that homelessness jumps when the rent burden is above 32%. So again, the share of income that people spend on rent. And further, 100 real estate markets across the U.S. have already exceeded that mark, which really just goes to show how this is a pervasive problem, not just in those three cities we mentioned, Scott, but in all other cities across the states too. So let's transition into how cities are advancing sustainability and equity at the same time.
Right. So ideally, a city's steps towards resiliency would have co-benefits that lead to sustainable development, like expanding urban agriculture, local energy development, affordable housing, things like that. And cities are trying to incorporate equity considerations and achieve those co-benefits with their sustainability efforts side by side.
And Scott, one way to accomplish this is through leadership specifically focused on equity. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, let's consider my hometown of Chicago, Jay.
Let's.
So when its new mayor, Lori Lightfoot, came into office a couple months ago, she announced the creation of a new position, a new CEO, a chief equity officer. So this is needed in Chicago, considering its metro area is the third most segregated in the country. White households earn 70% more than Latino households and more than twice as much as black households. Now, Chicago isn't the first to create a chief equity officer, and some cities have whole offices focused on this issue, but Chicago is one of the first to have this position at the cabinet level.
I just love the name Lori Lightfoot. It just rolls off the tongue very well.
Yeah.
So number 2, Scott, some cities are creating climate action plans that explicitly address equity. So for example, Portland released a climate action through equity plan in 2016. This plan acknowledges that Portland's prior carbon reduction plans lacked a discussion of who benefits and who is burdened. The plan also notes that low-income populations and communities of color will be disproportionately impacted by climate change, like we mentioned earlier, so it's important to make sure they are not underrepresented in climate programs and that they have a say in decision-making on climate policy.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, Jay, our listeners are probably like, oh, Portland would have such a plan. But they were making sustainability plans like from the early mid-90s, and they were doing them every 4 years. And it wasn't until pretty recently they were like, okay, wait, we're missing this whole equity thing. They went through quite a number of iterations. So here's an example of how the language changed after this focus on equity. And listeners, note the explicit mention in the new goal of collaboration and low-income residents. The goal in 2009 was collaborate to reduce the role of carbon, including from coal and natural gas sources, in Portland's electricity mix. Then in 2015, that goal changed, and it became collaborate with Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, customers, and stakeholders to reduce the carbon content in Portland's electricity mix by 3% per year, and mitigate potential cost burdens to low-income households, principally through efficiency measures that reduce energy use and cost.
Scott, I love that it just drilled into many more specifics
as it updated.
Too. Yeah. Definitely. So, Scott, that example was climate action plans that explicitly address equity. Another one is collaborating with community groups directly, which almost seems a little bit like a no-brainer. So, in Seattle, city staff partnered with trusted community groups to involve in the planning process a variety of organizations and leaders in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. Also, city staff receive training in institutional racism and climate justice so that they are better equipped to recognize and reduce the disproportionately high climate change risks confronting communities of color and struggling families.
Well, it sounds like they're doing so much in Seattle that they are having some sleepless nights.
Oh, wow.
Can we just talk about how cute Meg Ryan is? So cute.
I'll tell you, the first female celebrity to capture my heart, Scott, was Cameron Diaz.
If you put Meg Ryan and Cameron Diaz in their prime against each other, definitely Meg Ryan, instead of just like someone I want to hang out with and spend time with.
Well, consider also that Cameron Diaz was one of Charlie's Angels, so she could kick some serious hiney.
Whatever. Okay. So Jay, back to equity. Okay, so we could talk about a bunch of other cool examples, but we've got 2 interviewees coming your way that provide many more. So Jay, tell the listeners about who you interviewed.
That's right, Scott. So I interviewed Jerry Tinianow, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Denver, Colorado, as well as Rob Phocas, who is the Director of Sustainability for Charlotte, North Carolina, at the Smart Cities Connect conference here in Denver. Let's see what they've got to say. Elm Sustainability Partners brings you Rethink. Sustainability and ESG expectations for business have never been higher. More than 250 ESG ratings frameworks have been developed in the past 24 months. Consumer demand for sustainable products is real. Business-to-business relationships are increasingly defined by ESG performance. Is your program ready? Get your complimentary 15-minute ESG program maturity evaluation and report by visiting www.elmsustainability.com. And catch the book Killing Sustainability from Elm's Lawrence Heim, available in paperback or for Kindle on Amazon. All right, so I am here at the Smart Cities Connect conference in Denver, Colorado, seated across the table from Jerry Tinianow, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the City of Denver, as well as Rob Phocas, who is the Director of Sustainability of Charlotte, North Carolina. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
It's our pleasure.
So let's start with what got you both interested in sustainability. So was there an interest in the urban side of things to begin with, or was this something that you naturally gravitated to over the course of your career? Rob, why don't you kick us off?
So I gravitated to it. I was always interested in the environmental field, and that really started in undergrad. and continued pursuing that field the first few years after graduation, and then decided I wanted to go get a graduate degree. Ended up getting a law degree and a master's degree in environmental economics and policy. But I never wanted to be a full-time attorney, and always kept my eye on the policy angle. And when I was in Charlotte at a law firm, the city created their first environmental attorney position, which also had a policy bend to it, and was lucky enough to get that. And then when President Obama rolled out the energy efficiency and conservation block grant programs under the stimulus program, I volunteered to lead that, and that allowed me to move full-time into policy and stop practicing law.
You share a lot with my co-host Scott, who's not here today, but the law degree approach with not too much intention to practice law,
right,
which can be common. And Jerry, how about you? What brought you into the city context of sustainability?
I've been doing this kind of work literally since I was a teenager in college, and I won't give my age away, but let's just say sustainability as a term as we use it today wasn't around. So it's not that I set out to be working in sustainability, but I've been working in this area either as a volunteer or as a professional since that time. I went to college in Washington, also law school in Washington, and I did intend to practice law, and I did practice for 23 years doing this kind of work as a volunteer. I clerked for the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund in law school, and then when I came home to, at that time, Cleveland, Ohio, I started volunteering with the Sierra Club and kind of worked my way up the ladder. But I did eventually, in 2003, get an opportunity to be the state executive director for the National Audubon Society in Ohio, and that was my second career in bird conservation. But I've always had this interest in cities and space, really, how cities are put together, how they function, and how they work. And I became a kind of a hanger-on or a groupie for a group called the Congress for the New Urbanism. And then eventually I had an opportunity to move into this, first with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, and now my present position in Denver. So I didn't intend to go into sustainability. The term didn't even mean anything when I was first in college, but here I am.
Well, you find your way on the right podcast where we're trying to figure out also what sustainability really means. So
in the intro, we touched on the idea that every city really has its own story, and policies and frameworks that have developed over time may encourage one city to view sustainability and, in effect, equity and inclusion differently than another one. So, Jerry, you are handling sustainability in a blue city, in basically a blue state. Rob, not so much the same case.
Not so much.
From what I've understood, Charlotte itself might be a little bit blue, but the state, of course, is much more red than Colorado would be. I'm curious, what differences you guys might note between Denver and Charlotte, or just on the national scene, just how your cities perceive sustainability.
Yeah, we are a very blue city in a very red state. And if you look at the map after an election, our main urban areas are blue. So you've got Asheville and the Triangle with Raleigh and down in Wilmington. But I think the greatest impact it has on us is that Charlotte is not, or no municipality in North Carolina has home rule. So we're called a Dillon rule state, which means we only have the authority to do what the General Assembly gives us to do. So if we pass an ordinance, the General Assembly could override that ordinance. So you might have heard of cities that have banned plastic bags, and then their General Assembly overrides. I think that might have happened in Missouri, but it's the ban bag movement. So I think that's our biggest hurdle, being blue in a red state, is just knowing that it's not that we want to pass a lot of ordinances, but if we did, same with building codes, that there's a higher authority who has the prerogative to reverse or modify what we do.
And Jared, that might not be the case here in Denver.
It's interesting. In Denver, yes, we are a blue state, but we haven't always been a blue state. Mm-hmm. So in Colorado, what we deal with is a legacy of policies that were adopted before we were blue. Rob just mentioned the ban the bag statute that is being adopted in some states. That statute was adopted in Colorado 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's interesting that our General Assembly, now blue, is working to chisel away at it, maybe even repeal it, while the Ohio General Assembly, the state I used to be in, is considering adopting it. So even though we're a blue state, we still have to struggle with these legacy issues that are not going to go away anytime soon.
So definitely some interesting legal differences which probably play into the way sustainability can really operate on the ground. But let's say despite these political differences in the structures of the cities, the idea of equity is probably pretty similar, at least the core principles behind it.
However, when we talk to folks in sustainability, oftentimes the first things that come to mind are sexy mobility systems or green building infrastructure, and equity, less so. Inclusion, maybe this topic is coming more and more to the forefront, but why might you guys think that's the case?
Well, and I think that's changing, and I think that the conference that we've been attending is testament to that, because I think there's a lot more, might not be called equity, you see a lot more about community engagement, which I think is just another way of saying equity. But when Jerry and I started as sustainability directors, and we're both members of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is made up of sustainability directors in the United States and Canada, I'd say we were really focused on more of environmental sustainability, where sustainability can be defined either just as environmental sustainability, but nowadays I think it's moved to the triple bottom line. So it's economic, it's social equity, and it's environment. And what I've seen, and this spills over into the smart city space as well, is a recognition that you really need to, as a government entity, be looking at the needs and wants of your residents just very intently. I think that was always the case, but now I think there's a really big push, especially in historically disenfranchised communities, to not try to do a one-size-fits-all, but how is this neighborhood different from that neighborhood? It could be socioeconomic, it could be racial, it could be, a history that they've had with the government or another entity. And I think one of the reasons that that's happening is because there have been more and more programs in our space and in the smart city space that haven't been successful. And there's been a bit of a backlash, especially in the smart city space. When you start looking at the deployment of sensors or cameras, something that's collecting data, and there hasn't been the appropriate level of engagement, which of course is going to differ depending on where you are. When something finally gets deployed and people truly understand what's going on, then there's a backlash, and in some cases we've seen that technology be shut down or completely done away with. So, it's something that I'd say in the past 2 or 3 years at our USDN conferences, it's something that's always been in the background, but now you're just seeing it really start to come to the forefront.
I think you bring a great point, because the example of the scooters now, the electric scooters, is so poignant to me, because oftentimes when you see them in cities, it's a very particular population, typically white, typically affluent, that's riding them. And while that might not be the fault of the designers, it just speaks to the need to incorporate this kind of thinking from the beginning, so that you really have an idea of who, to your point, is the community that this product is meant for. So, Jerry, along the lines of this equity conversation, we know that city sustainability officers touch so many different aspects of city life. Are there any aspects that are particularly difficult to progress from an equity perspective?
Well, I think the word difficult explains exactly why sustainability officers have struggled with equity. Because if you know the history of sustainability, it came out of environmental protection, but it came out of that because of a recognition that there were gaps in conventional environmental protection. They did not always work well with the economy, and they did not always work well with equity. And we try to balance the three of them very thoughtfully and mindfully in Denver. And the reason it's difficult is that it often leads to results that people don't expect from the sustainability folks. And I'll give you an example. I don't want to step on any toes, so I'll describe this fairly generically. We've been having a debate about whether we should create a special fund to acquire parkland in the downtown area. Because our downtown, we weren't as thoughtful as we should have been decades ago. It's filling up. There's more and more residents. And some believe and have proposed that we should create a special fund to acquire parkland now while we can still do it. However, in my office, we have questioned that by pointing out that the people who are living in the downtown area are upper income people who have chosen to come into the downtown area knowing that there was no parkland here, and that whatever fund we create, there's only so much money to go around. So we have pushed back and said, we actually oppose this. We think if there is a special fund, it should be spent in the neighborhoods that have traditionally not been served, not simply by parks and green space, but not even by trees. In a lot of these areas, the city will give trees away to anyone, but in the lower income neighborhoods, they can't afford to water the trees, which is a big issue in the arid West. And so when we make arguments like that, we surprise people. People say, oh, you're a green person, you're a sustainability person, you must like parks. Of course you're going to support this proposal. And we don't. We get into it with parking issues, where a development comes in and they want to put a huge parking lot on their development so it doesn't push cars into the neighborhood. A lot of people are fine with that, but we say, well, but why can't this neighborhood, the low-income neighborhood next door, why can't they have the same permit rules that the upper-income neighborhoods have? So, we raise issues that people don't expect from sustainability folks, and that is, I think, why we have difficulty with some of these. You can talk about it generally, but when you start applying it to specifics, it leads to results that not everyone expects.
This is a great transition into this idea of gentrification, which is obviously a very complex topic. And we broke down the principles a little bit earlier in the episode. But complications aside, do your cities have any policies that are aimed to insulate those living in less affluent areas from getting priced out by new buildings? Rob, we can start with you.
Yeah, that is complicated by the fact that we are not a home rule state. Mm-hmm. So it's hard when you have very limited tools to address something to be able to address it. So as we see gentrification happening in Charlotte, which is one of the fastest growing cities in the country, we have a really big push around affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So we had a $50 million bond that passed, and now the city is working with the private sector to raise an additional $50 million. The question is, how do we not only build new affordable housing, but how can we address the housing we already have, be it single family in low income or duplex or quads or multifamily? So it's something we're actively engaged in, but is made difficult because we have a very limited legal authority to take certain actions.
And, in Denver, I want to point out gentrification is not bad. Although it has gained a reputation of being bad. Gentrification, having people of different incomes living in the same neighborhood, is actually good, because the opposite of gentrification is segregation, and we don't want that. Displacement is bad. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to solve is, we would like gentrification. We would like people of mixed income living in all neighborhoods, not just having people with higher income able to move into lower income neighborhoods, but also having lower income people move into higher income neighborhoods. And you can call that degentrification or whatever, but we would like to have both happening. And the key, where we found a successful approach, is the creative use of space. We have a project in Denver called the Mariposa Project, where a previously 100% low-income housing, public housing project that had 2-story brick buildings was replaced with new buildings that were 5 stories. And in the 5-story buildings, because now there's more units, we have the same number of units reserved for public housing, but we also have other units that are kind of in between public and market rate, and others that are market rate. And within those buildings, you can't tell which unit is public, which one is market rate, and so forth. And when they change hands, they can change type as well. And so the result is that in that neighborhood, we were able to bring new people in with higher incomes without pushing the existing residents out, because we made creative use of space. We're now pursuing another project, a nearby area called Sun Valley, where we hope to do the same thing. But it succeeds only if you're mindful about it. Mm-hmm. And if you say we want to have people of mixed income living in the same neighborhood, but we have to find a way to do that without displacing the people who grew up there. And that is a challenge. Not every place can be like Mariposa.
Well, that's a fantastic point. I'm curious to know what the reception of the project has been since it's been completed.
Oh, people love it. I mean, we took our advisory council over there a few years ago for a tour. And it's not just, mixing the size of the building and the units. They've also put amenities into the neighborhood that appeal to everyone. They updated the rec center. They updated the pool. They offered cooking classes in the neighborhood, and so forth. And a lot of the people on our advisory council said, hey, let me know when an apartment opens up. I would like to move in here. It's also next to a light rail station. And, when we measure affordability in Denver, we look at the combination of housing cost and transportation cost, not just the cost of the housing. And so if we can lower the transportation cost in a neighborhood, that's one way of addressing affordability. To us, affordability is not what percentage of the area median income is housing. Affordability is how much money do you have in your pocket on the last day of the month.
I mean, Jerry makes a great point about having mixed income communities, right? I think that ultimately is your goal. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've found working, so I run a program, it's called our North End Smart District, which is in 8 neighborhoods that have historically been disfranchised, some of our lowest income neighborhoods, is you talk to some of the people and they're happy that this gentrification is happening because it's bringing more amenities to the area that they've never had before. What you get, though, is those folks want to be able to keep that fabric and character of each neighborhood, so they're very fearful of losing that. And then they know that there are people who have no desire to leave. And it's that balance of you want to have more amenities, you do want more people, you kind of want, what's that saying, all tides lift all boats? Raising,
right, the rising tide lifts all boats. Right, yeah.
But one of the things that we're seeing in Charlotte, and it's not unique to Charlotte, is predatory buying practices, where especially our older residents are being targeted. They're getting letters in the mail. They're literally having people come to their door and offering them cash for their homes, which for some of these people is a substantial amount of cash, but it's not fair market value when you consider all that's going on in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So, to me, that's a big equity issue, is how do those people who, by no fault of their own, just aren't aware of the dynamics that are happening around them, how are they protected and well-informed? And these 8 neighborhoods that we work with in the Smart District have their own association called the North End Community Coalition, and they actually got a grant to do an education series for their neighbors to say, this is actually what's going on around you, and here are some resources that you could tap into if predatory buyers are coming, if you need loan assistance, if you need whatever. So I think education is a big piece of the equity equation when it comes to gentrification.
And was it tough to line up the financing to provide that education?
So the community group applied for the grant on their own and were successful in getting it. And I think one of the reasons that they were successful is because it's a very pressing issue, and they went with a great game plan. We want to have 3 sessions in different parts of the North End, and this is what we want to tackle. And if it's successful, we'll look to do more. So it was successful, and now I think they're trying to figure out, can we do this again? Because this is all volunteer time. These are leaders who care about their community, care about their residents, and they've got to fit it into their schedule while they're trying to do their jobs and raise their kids and take care of parents and such.
So we have here 2 pretty concrete examples of getting this equity idea into practice. Are there any lessons you both have learned from these processes as far as how to engage what are possibly underrepresented groups earlier on in the process, so that it's more proactive as opposed to reactive, if that makes sense?
Definitely. And I think it's, if it's around economic development, it's about environment, whatever it's about, I think where it really starts is having that very early transparent conversation with, hopefully neighborhood leaders or someone who has influence in the community, that you can put an idea forward to and get very honest feedback from. And I'll give you a great example of that. When we first put together the vision for the Smart District, which was based on other smart districts around the world, it wasn't anything incredibly unique. My colleagues, after I asked them, recommended I go and speak to this one gentleman who's kind of this 3rd generation unofficial, and Jerry heard the story the other day, unofficial mayor of the North End. And after I laid out this vision, for 2 hours at his dining room table, the first thing he said to me was, "This is all great, but you need to earn our trust. We don't trust you. You're, white, middle-aged government official coming in here. We've had plenty of you here before." And then the next thing he said was, "You can't have the northern boundary be where it is, because that is the old dividing line between the good side of town and bad side of town. We've gotten rid of that, and now you want to come in and call it smart side, dumb side. You just can't do that." So having those types of conversations early on, where you're both really honest with each other, and you get that champion in the community, and you're really respecting where people are coming from, and if they don't want to do something, you don't do it. But if they do, then you use the resources you have and that others have that you're connected to achieve the mutual goals. So it's all about the co-development, co-implementation, co-critiquing of projects that we're doing with the residents there.
Jerry, does that ring true in the Mile High City as well?
It does, and I think a lesson we've learned, and I'm sure Rob will agree, is the one technique that doesn't work very well is the conventional public meeting. The conventional public meeting does not work very well. Everyone hates them. The same people show up over and over and over. They tend to be the people who don't want any change in their neighborhood and so forth. And so what we've learned in Denver is the best place to engage people is not in a setting like that, but where you're more likely to find them at ease, whether in a grocery store, a bowling alley. Yeah, I actually learn a lot in the locker room of my local city rec center, just listening to people talking there, or intercepting people, on the way out of church or a high school football game or something like that. That you will actually get a better sense of what's going on in your community there than holding the conventional meetings. You still have to do the meetings because often there are statutes or laws that require you to do it. But that's not the only way you can do it. And we have recently just completed our comprehensive planning process and our long-term vision process called Blueprint. We had an incredible engagement process in that over a period of 2 years, we had individual contacts with 25,000 different people, which is amazing. And so that's the model. And we did it in so many different ways. We played games with people. We had online interaction things. We went to libraries and grocery stores and so forth. And I think we have a better sense of what the community wants than we would have gotten if we just had the series of the same old public meetings.
I think that's a great point because, I don't think you're wrong, unfortunately, about how these public meetings, it's almost like Yelp reviews, right? The people that are most likely to write the reviews are doing so because they are so passionate about it, and it's usually not in a good way.
I will add, if you are going to do the large public meeting, you need food.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the other lessons I learned early on was that, having a conversation when you're breaking bread usually goes a lot better than when you're not.
The grassroots army marches on its stomach.
That's right.
Have there been any specific types of foods that work better than others?
It depends on the neighborhood. So you work with the neighborhood leaders, and what we try to do is get local food vendors, right? So a local caterer or something, as opposed to maybe somebody that we'd use at the government center. And they like that food because they know it. So we usually say to them, who could we get to cater, a 20-person meeting, and in some case, it was a 150-person meeting. I think we actually used the same person. They just hired more people to cook more food. But what's also nice about that is it's familiarity. They know this food. They know the people who are serving it. It's part of the community. So, and I think that's another important point in the work we do. And I mentioned this story the other day as well. When we had first started off with our Smart Cities engagement, we had picked a video that we would show to people to help them understand what a smart city is. And the leaders were aghast that we were going to show this. And we said, well, what can we do? And they said, well, one of the neighborhood leaders actually does videography for a living. Awesome. You should talk to him about hiring him. So we did. He shot it with local residents in their homes, on their streets. And when we were done showing it, everyone stood up and cheered because they recognized their neighbors. They recognized the houses. So, it's looking for those opportunities, to really not just have a conversation, but really get into the fabric of a community, which you can't always do depending on timelines. Sometimes you just have to move really quickly. and depending on the resources that you have, we were fortunate enough to be able to have the resources and the time. We had a grant over a year that was really focused on engagement, and removing those barriers to engagement, be it childcare, transportation, food, whatever it may be.
So this is not an easy topic either to really discuss or put into practice. In your experiences, have there been any misconceptions or mistakes that you think people that typically try to promote equity might be making? I mean, the story you told, Rob, just now is a good example of, having a local videographer shoot these videos, bringing in local food. What have you seen that might be a misconception around trying to make this issue better?
Part of it is that you need to, before you have the conversations in the neighborhood, you need to go into the neighborhood and just hang out and see what's going on and where people tend to gather and so forth. You really cannot go in with any preconceived notions in there. And I'll give you an example of this. As part of a neighborhood planning effort in a Latino neighborhood, we gamified one of the issues. We created a map of the neighborhood with different sections there, and we gave people, there were 16 different blocks describing 16 different types of buildings or activities that you could have in the neighborhood. And we told people, you can put 4 out of the 16 in each neighborhood. We want to see which 4 you put in each neighborhood. And I was observing a group of Latino women who did not speak English. And, one of the stereotypes that we've heard is, well, the lower income people, they love fast food. They eat too much fast food, and that's part of the problem. So one of those blocks was called drive-through. It was if you wanted to drive through in the neighborhood. And I watched these women. I don't speak Spanish. They were speaking entirely Spanish. And I watched them allocate their blocks to all of the neighborhoods in this area. And they did not use drive-through once. So they didn't want the drive-through. They were eating there not because they loved drive-through, but because that's all that was there for them. They were happy to have it out of their neighborhood. And so that's why I say, to the extent you can watch things like that happen, you'll have a better sense than just going in with your preconceived notions.
So let's take all of these lessons now and send them towards our listeners. So we have listeners in, we're about 60% in the U.S. Globally is the remaining 40. So, whether we're in Charlotte or Denver or Barcelona, maybe, how would you suggest our listeners promote equity in their cities? Are there particular skills you guys have picked up or tactics that you've learned to help progress this stuff, really anywhere?
I think equity starts with awareness. Really, it starts with self-awareness. It starts with understanding that you may think you understand the situation of the people who've been held back or held down, but you shouldn't assume that you do, and that you need to become more aware of how they think, how they operate, how they behave, rather than jumping right to your own preconceived notions.
Yeah, I was going to say a self-awareness as well. I think that's the first step. And being very humble in your assessment of where you are. But then I think it's not only self-awareness then, but community awareness. Just when you're going into different situations, being aware of what's around you and what you're stepping into, regardless of, what neighborhood you're stepping into. If it's the historically more affluent, the historically less affluent, you just have to always be thinking that one size doesn't fit all. I think kind of being that humble public servant that, you hate hearing the expression, we're the government, we're here to help. And, we're here to partner. We're here to collaborate. We're here to work with you to make your quality of life the best it could be, from if it's fixing the pothole to bridging the digital divide and everything in between.
Well said. So our last question for you is the last question we ask all of our guests, which is essentially a party fact about equity. I don't know if it's a great party fact because equity is a pretty serious issue, but let's say maybe we're at a community engagement meeting like this. Maybe we're chatting with someone in the locker room or at the bowling alley, and we want to convey how important of an issue equity is, whether that's some statistic about however many people are disenfranchised or what the mobility is like between classes, what might that party fact be that we can pass on to our listeners so they can share that with others to get them engaged on this topic?
What I would say is change your vocabulary to the very simple use of the term to everybody or for everybody. We want everybody to have affordable access to basic resources, to have the good and the bad, but that the rule we follow here is where equity is not possible in a given situation, you can only put a landfill, let's say, one place. Then you need to distribute the benefits more to the groups that have traditionally been disadvantaged or not had those resources. And you also need to keep the bad things away from them more than you would otherwise do.
Excellent.
Yeah, party fact. So if you're in Charlotte, so let's say this is directed to Charlotte people.
Sure.
One important fact that hit us really hard several years ago was that when you look at the top 50 largest cities by population in the U.S., we rank dead last in terms of economic mobility. Mm. So, I think it was a real wake-up call for, let's say, the uptown crowd, but not for a lot of the other neighborhoods. Sure. So this gets back to the awareness that, we're a tale of two cities right now. And getting back to the metaphor, which I'll screw up, is, tides.
Well, the lifting the lifting tide raises all boats.
Right. It's just so true because we had, an example of, I think, where that report and then having police-involved shootings boiled over was, an uprising that we had in Charlotte that was reaction to both of those events, that there's just not an opportunity for lower income communities, especially minority communities in Charlotte, like there is for white upper middle class Charlotteans.
Yeah, and let me comment on the rising tide lifts all boats.
I got to write that down in my arm.
Because it's actually not true. If some of those boats are anchored to the bottom by, let's say, a pole or a rod, then the incoming tide just sinks them.
Like that.
And so that's what you need to keep in mind is a lot of people in our communities are anchored to the bottom through some circumstance or whatever. And the rising tide will not lift all boats unless you cut them off of that pole or whatever it is that's holding them to the bottom. Then it will work. And so you need to be mindful of that in your policy making.
Good. I will change my metaphor. I remember what the words actually are.
Hopefully I hadn't tattooed on an arm
right.
yet. Well, Jerry and Rob, thanks so much for joining us, especially at such a cool conference that's focused on so many things, but of course equity being such an important part of that. And not even the word equity, maybe just to everyone, for everyone, to make sure we're moving in the right direction. But thank you both for joining us today. It's been great speaking with you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Scott, in the interest of equity and recognizing all parties at the table, why don't you tell us the joke to end the episode this time?
Well, it took you 41 episodes, Jay, and you're finally letting me tell the joke. So, okay, Jay, why are environmentalists bad at playing cards?
Do tell.
They like to avoid the flush.
Wow. And I can say, Scott, that flushing our toilets is probably something that all of us do relatively equitably.
Well, it's certainly, there was a time, I've lived in this group house for 4 years, and there was a time where people were like, can you please remember to flush every time? And I was like, but it's, I'm saving water. I'm like, I don't care.
I'll never forget on the local news growing up here in Denver, a newscaster came on with a straight face, said, if it's brown, flush it down. If it's yellow, let it mellow.
Let it mellow. Yeah, sure.
I've never been able to forget it.
Of course. That's what we say at summer camp.
And Scott, just a couple updates for the listeners. So listeners have probably heard me plug Ground Up Impact over the last few hiatus episodes. Well, here's just a quick update. It's been incredible to see the types of impact-oriented companies that folks are starting all over the world. And actually, my very first client, which is a cold brew coffee company based in London named Jungle Brew, just launched last week. Actually, they timed it perfectly with one of Europe's hottest days on record. So as a reminder, Ground Up Impact makes environmental and social ventures profitable. If you have a sustainable business venture that you're looking to scale to profitability, look no further. Check out groundupimpact.com for more on the services I provide and how to get in touch. And number 2, Scott, of course, this pertains to you. The Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Sustainability and Circular Economy Summit is happening on August 15th and 16th in DC. Listeners can use code SD for a 25% discount. All right, as we wrap up this episode, we would like to thank Rashali Chaplot for her support researching the intro notes. We'd also like to thank Square Peg Round Hole and Potions for the music we use. And we are still on the lookout for an editor who has experience or wants experience editing audio in GarageBand. If that's you, let us know.
So yeah, email us at hosts@sustainabilitydefined.com with your interest. We also want to read a review that we received on iTunes because we hope that this incentivizes you, if you have not taken the time already, to just quickly go on to iTunes and write that review. And it can be on Apple Podcasts too, of course. So we have one from Lauren on the DL, who wrote a review on May 25th, 2019. Here it is. I have been on the hunt for a solid podcast that is lightly numerous. She probably meant humorous, but also very educational about sustainability. And not just the environmental or the business side, all sides, the big shebang. This podcast might not be the original OG, but it is the most broad, yet deep OG. BYD OG? Yeah, that works. For those who don't know, OG means original. I'm using it wrong here, but that's the point. Duh. This deserves the credit of OG because it's that good. End quote.
I have never been swept off my feet like this, Scott.
Jay, what is BYD OG? Like, what's BYD? I get that OG is original.
Scott, how can you
Gangster.
forget? That's the broad yet deep OG.
Really? Are you serious? Is that what it means?
Well, it's as Lauren on the DL defined it.
Did she say broad, but is the most... Oh, okay. Huh. Wow.
Yeah, she really... She took us there.
And OG is original gangster, right?
Which is, of course, how I would describe the two of us.
Gangsta, not gangster.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Okay. On that note, actually, on that note, this is a good transition. All of our intro notes are posted on our website at sustainabilitydefined.com. Scott, we just worked in a new searchable feature where you can pretty easily search for whatever you're looking for throughout our whole site. On top of that, folks, please, as Scott mentioned, not only review us on iTunes, but rate us and subscribe so you get all of our newest content on the first Friday of every month. And if you are so inclined, help support us on Patreon. Score yourself some awesome perks in the process. Patreon.com/sustainabilitydefined. And lastly, any comments, questions, concerns, bad jokes for us, email us at hosts@sustainabilitydefined.com.
I think that about does it, Jay. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.